Hey. So today we'll be talking about psychological first aid. As discussed, my name is Nicole. I'm a crisis administrator with the Utah Department of Health and Human Services. So that means that I oversee our disaster behavioral health crisis counselor program, as well as I oversee the state's community crisis continuum. So that would include our statewide crisis line, which serves as our 988 National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline affiliate. I oversee the state's mobile crisis outreach teams, and I also oversee state's receiving centers and community-based or home-based stabilization efforts. So I have a career of over 10 years in crisis service provision. It's really I'm quite a passionate person about this field, and it's wonderful to share some knowledge with you today. Okay. All right. So today, what we are going to be doing is learning a little bit about psychological first aid. And our learning objectives will be to learn about when you can deliver psychological first aid, identify some of the early intervention principles, and spend a little time exploring those, and then just learn about the 8 basic objectives of psychological first aid, and then be able to apply or explain or understand how psychological first aid is truly a very flexible modality. You can do a lot of different things. And because this is not a complete psychological first aid training, I will also point you in the direction of where you can receive free psychological first aid or free skills for psychological recovery training. So just a disclaimer today, I just want to note that psychological first aid is not a training developed by Department of Health and Human Services here in Utah. The training was actually developed by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the National Center for PTSD, specifically out of UCLA, actually. And what we are presenting here today or reviewing here today is not a complete training for psychological first aid. And though we're going to cover some of the basic principles, you won't necessarily, you shouldn't consider yourself trained in psychological first aid with this limited overview, though I hope that what you find is valuable and interests you to learn a little bit more. Okay, so what is psychological first aid? So psychological first aid is an evidence-based treatment modality meant to help survivors in the aftermath of disasters, terrorism, or other emergencies. And really, it's a modality that's not necessarily used to address PTSD or necessarily complex behavioral health issues. But really, it's truly a modality that can be used by a wide variety of people, all the way from people who have credentials and experience to volunteers who, this may be their first time responding to a disaster. And really, the goal is to be able to reduce distress and foster coping in individuals as well as communities. So I would love, and I know that we are kind of in a bit of a hybrid format today, but, if you can think in your head, perhaps those are online, if you want to throw some in the chat and I can read them out, or if you're in person, be able to share, what is a disaster? In 1 to 2 words, how do you synopsize this complex phenomena of disaster? It's something that I grapple with sometimes when trying to explain my work, right? How big, how small. So if anybody has any ideas or things that come to mind, I welcome you to be able to raise your hand and say them, or to throw them in the chat. I'll give people a few minutes.
I can type them in for you.
Sure, go ahead.
Unexpected.
Unexpected, absolutely. Yeah, it's something that we should be preparing for, but it's always unexpected when it happens. So yeah. Okay, excellent. Hey, anything else come to mind?
Turmoil.
So turmoil, all right, yeah, absolutely. It can involve a good amount of chaos and turmoil. Okay, all right. And then I've got some responses in the chat too. So mass casualty, calamity, disruption, traumatic event, and earthquake, right? So yeah, there's specific disasters, natural, such as an earthquake, right? Another person put in here a mass casualty event, right? That could be natural or man-made. Something out of your control. Yes, I think that disaster is kind of moving in the field of general crisis intervention, and where, you know, a lot of people that are really broadening the scope of what disaster means, right? Or what emergency means. And then an event that causes significant disruption, absolutely. And then an abnormal event that causes trauma to many people, right? So for instance, if you're thinking about that, a small community could have 1 or 2 suicides or 1 or 2 overdoses, and that could be disastrous to their community, right? Difficulty, yeah, or it's difficult. There's confusion, absolutely. Excellent. All of these things, right? So I love this exercise like with a word cloud, because you tend to see that, you know, oftentimes there's similar trends and themes, but yeah, difficult, calamity, confusion, trauma, you know, really, you know, quite heavy words. But I think that there's also opportunity in disaster, right? There's opportunity for growth and healing and resilience. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Yeah, so unity, absolutely, Jackie. I think that's an important consideration. Every crisis contains in it, right, a challenge and an opportunity. And I don't think that disaster is any different. Okay. So we're gonna move on to the next slide here, and let's see. Okay, so a disaster, right, as many of you mentioned, right, is an emergency. You know, the numerous types of disaster, not all listed here, oftentimes include evident or incidents of terrorism, mass violence, so to include like a mass casualty event, a public health emergency. So our most recent disaster here, a large-scale disaster, of course, was the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So this was a large-scale global public health emergency. And then, of course, right, school-based crises, right? You know, in terms of incidents of violence or threats of violence, these are disruptive events that are causing a lot of trauma to their communities and children and adults alike. And of course, right, there's classifications as well, natural or man-made disasters, that all kind of fit within the larger umbrella of what we consider to be disaster. So when we consider the various, I guess, veins of disasters, what we find is that, you know, natural versus human disasters tend to have, you know, different, I guess, flavors, right? And you may, as victim advocates, have seen this, right, in terms of your initial response as well as ongoing response, right? And what we see is that when it comes to disasters, blame is a characteristic that can differ significantly between what is considered natural and what is something that can be considered a human-caused disaster, right? So people who survive human-caused disasters oftentimes feel a lot of anger and blame towards individuals, groups, or organizations that they may feel contributed to the disaster or caused the disaster. And survivors of natural disasters may feel a lot of guilt. So, you know, for instance, they may lack themselves or blame themselves for a lack of preparedness, or feeling like it's God's will or some sort of punishment, right? So I think that one of the considerations here is that sometimes we can see a natural disaster really compounded by human factors, right? So 2 examples of this, right, are, of course, right, the COVID-19 pandemic, where there was a lot of misinformation, And it was a lot of confusing mixed messages from national and global partners. But then we can also really see like large scale disasters such as Hurricane Katrina or Uvalde, the school shooting, where we had both of those, one was natural and one was man-made, but truly, right, the initial disaster was like of an impressive magnitude, but then the human elements really compounded the disaster and made it worse, right? So these are considerations of how it's not always clear cut, right? So sometimes we can have damage from an initial disaster that are compounded. So such as like a natural disaster that are compounded by inadequate planning, governmental policies that are burdensome or, offer misinformation or, essentially faulty warning systems, everything like that. So when you're providing disaster or crisis response in the community, it's really, really natural to anticipate anger and blame towards various parties. And that when we see that, right, we know that our recovery is oftentimes going to be protracted. So grief counseling and psychological recovery, so skills for psychological recovery are absolutely indicated. We still now track how many crisis calls come into our statewide crisis line that are related to COVID. And, we still haven't reached the number 0. And anytime we see kind of a flood of news information, we tend to see our numbers spike with COVID related concerns. So we're still really kind of grappling this natural human caused disaster and the complex emotions that are related to it. So when we think about the phases of disaster preparedness and emergency management, psychological first aid really is a core component of the response, right? So it involves a ton of education and outreach, but it also involves a heavy amount of triage and referral, right? So something that victim advocates oftentimes are very familiar with. You're not necessarily the ongoing behavioral health providers, but you may be the initial responder, or you may be the first series of interactions following a very traumatic or an emergency event, that your job, right, is oftentimes going to be to triage, connect with resources, but in times of additional need, you'll want to refer out. When we think about what disaster looks like in terms of a community level response, we see that there's this pre-disaster, right? And, similar to how we're all sitting here having this conversation, there may be various different stages of preparedness or training, but there could be also like signs that are warnings, right? And then we have the initial impact. And that the time following the impact, right? If we can think about large scale disasters such as the Boston Marathon bombing, 9/11, even the initial state, like the initial couple of weeks after the pandemic, we tend to see this heroic right response. And you may have seen this as a victim advocate, perhaps large, like responding to like a large scale car crash or something like that, where you see people that are being activated in their role, they're in their element, and community members are rallying around. It doesn't mean that they haven't experienced a trauma, but because there is direct motivation and a sense of purpose, oftentimes people feel happy or fulfilled, and even in the face of disaster, they're doing what they're trained to do, and many times they feel very confident and feel like they're good at it, right? In terms of that, this heroic phase, oftentimes it gives way to a bit of a honeymoon phase, where the people that are responding to the disaster and the community really say, okay, well, we've done a wonderful job. This is great. And they continue to feel very supported, right? And this can last from weeks to months. But then it doesn't hold, similar to, for instance, with domestic violence, right? there's this period of honeymoon before the tension building. Honeymooning with disaster and emergency preparedness gives way to disillusionment, right? So this is where the veil is lifted and people oftentimes are feeling very frustrated, angry, disappointed, essentially with their communities, with themselves, with loved ones. And, essentially this kind of veil or this rose-colored glass is lifted from the heroic and honeymoon type stage. Oftentimes, right, we see that emotional states or affective states, both on the individual and the community level, tend to rise. So for instance, people become more escalated or experience more behavioral health symptoms around trigger events, right? So that could be anniversaries. It could be, with the COVID pandemic, we saw a lot of surges, essentially, different waves of different strains really were very triggering for the community. And then eventually we really do try and work towards a reconstruction phase. So if we are to look at the pandemic, right, I would say that there are people who are still very disillusioned, but much of the country has kind of accepted that we are in a reconstruction. This is the new beginning from repairing from this disaster, right? And that involves working through grief and working through trauma, etc. When you consider psychological first aid, the communities, essentially move through phases of disaster at a different rate. But when you're applying psychological first aid, typically what we see is that it's applied within the heroic and honeymoon towards the beginning of disillusionment, right? There's some overlap between psychological first aid and skills for psychological recovery, in which skills for psychological recovery is kind of provided with that more protracted response. But, we want to be able to work through our grief process, to be able to process disaster losses and really develop constructive building towards future growth and development. And that's really where psychological first aid and skills for psychological recovery work in tandem. When we consider disaster psychological first aid, there's oftentimes a lot of confusion between what's the difference between psychological first aid and another common model, critical incident stress debriefing, which many of you, if you have worked with law enforcement or EMS partners, may be familiar with. So the skills used in both of these models are not mutually exclusive. So oftentimes there's a lot of overlap in terms of what the providers of both programs are doing. However, there's been direct evidence indicating that psychological first aid is indicated and helpful, while CISD or critical incident stress debriefing and its new rendition of critical incident stress management are not helpful and potentially harmful for disaster or emergency survivors. And one of the considerations here is that psychological debriefing really shouldn't be used for people who have been recently exposed to a traumatic event. And the World Health Organization recognizes that the use of psychological debriefing in this manner doesn't reduce the risk of post-traumatic or anxiety or depressive symptoms. And there has been specific research indicating that CISD and CISM not only may not improve recovery, but may increase the risk of developing PTSD. So there is some overlap in the foundational skills, but the applications are very different. And we just want to be mindful in terms of what recommend practice that we're using with very vulnerable populations. So when we go back to psychological first aid, we want to consider who this model is for. And the wonderful thing about psychological first aid is it is so incredibly versatile. So it could be used for children, adults, families, communities, right? So during the pandemic, we did a ton of community level response, being able to provide support to various different groups, or training for community members to provide support for their own communities, as well as first responders. So really a very adaptable model, very flexible, and widely applicable. So, when we think about the word survivor, psychological first aid, we say is for a survivor of a disaster. But I want you to give some consideration to what you consider as the word survivor, right? Because I think sometimes we have a very narrow lens of what it means to be a survivor, right? Oftentimes limiting it to somebody that is directly impacted by a crime or an incident. And the truth is that when we consider disaster or emergencies or incidents that are causing trauma or disruption, that the scope of who we consider survivor is so incredibly broad. And psychological first aid really can be very helpful for all of these groups if they choose to participate in it. So when we consider the word survivor, so specifically in disaster behavioral health and emergency behavioral health, we're thinking about anybody who could potentially be impacted. So that's somebody with a direct exposure. It could be somebody that was injured, but it could be somebody that witnessed it. So for instance, there were the recent earthquakes in Turkey, and I was talking with some of my colleagues, and they were describing really traumatic reactions to watching the footage of people, screaming with their loved ones and children's and babes in arms, right? And because these people are witnessing an actual disaster, really a catastrophic loss of life, and thereafter they're watching people dig through the footage, or dig through essentially I'm forgetting the word, but essentially the damage, right? And they're seeing real human trauma in real time. And we now live in a world where not only are we thinking about people that are directly witnessing it, but we're thinking about secondary, tertiary, all different levels of exposure and witness to disasters. And then, of course, right, not only those people who have had this exposure or witnessed an event, but the people that are in communities and love and care for them. They will also be impacted by a disaster, even having never been directly impacted or witnessing it. I think it's really important to note that the vast majority of people who witness or live through an emergency or disaster recover, and they recover without professional intervention. But psychological first aid is really something bigger than that. It's understanding that survivors really experience a broad level and broad range of early reactions, and that should they want and seek out or accept help, recovery can be aided and supported by people who are compassionate and caring, essentially in their response. So we're going to talk a little bit about individual reactions to trauma. So one of the concerns is, we know that severity of trauma and severity of reactions really can vary by the level of exposure, the amount of casualties, but it can also be impacted by somebody's previous experience with a similar event, or their pre-existing trauma for an event that is dissimilar, right? So any of these things can really contribute to an elevated reaction. So disaster crisis counselors, such as yourself as victim advocates or emergency crisis counselors, really we want to identify and refer anybody who is experiencing severe reactions for really advanced level help, and get them the support that they need. So of course, there's going to be a wide range from mild to severe symptoms, right? So mild could be so of course, right, feeling like you are worried or restless, not sleeping. But of course, right, a more severe reaction to a disaster would of course be the development of PTSD, some kind of psychotic state as well could also be present. So our behavioral reactions could include really isolating, pacing, fidgeting, arguing, fatigue, feeling very tired and not rested despite sleeping, but an increase in risk taking behaviors, right? I think another consideration is that some people, right, may not realize they're experiencing these symptoms, but you as an outside provider, as a helper, may recognize some of these and offer education and support around it. Of course, right, there's emotional responses in terms of what people experience following a disaster, right? So such as anger and detachment, those are to be common, right, or common and to be expected. I think that it's really important that there's no wrong emotional response, right? One important consideration is that people will go through varied, but oftentimes will experience some sort of response. But letting them know that their responses are not like typical to an abnormal event can, of course, right, go a long way to helping them feel better. Yeah. So some of the common reactions, of course, right, will include some physical reactions. So it's really helpful to know that physical symptoms can be typical for disaster response or for disaster victims or survivors. So when we note that of course physical reactions are present, I think that oftentimes people realize that we're not necessarily providing physical symptoms, right? Relief in behavioral health, but I think that it's really important that we recognize that physical symptoms can really interfere with somebody's long-term functioning or their ability to be resilient. So for instance, if they're having some sort of limitation secondary to a disaster, they may not be able to work, take care of their children, take care of loved ones, and they really do need help or connection with people for treatment of such things. And then, of course, right, we have many symptoms of cognition that are common for disaster survivors, right? To include flashbacks, reminders of previous trauma, nightmares, difficulty concentrating, confusion, right? And difficulty making decisions, etc. So any number of these common thoughts really are generally self-explanatory, but I think that one of the important considerations is that it's really helpful to as a provider to distinguish between flashbacks and memories. So a person who has a flashback is experiencing essentially that flashback as it's a real life event now. It's quite unsettling or disarming when you witness it, because they're not remembering what happened, right? It's a feeling as if it's happening all over again, and it's completely different than being reminded of past experiences. And it can essentially pulling somebody from a flashback is going to be very different than redirecting them from a memory. So some of the 5 principles of disaster response that are grounded in psychological first aid that we'll review today is, of course, safety, calm, connectedness, self and community efficacy, and hope. So when we consider safety, we want to remember that survivors are often concerned about not only themselves, but also their loved ones, right? So in order to ensure that there can be emotional safety, we have to first assess and provide for physical safety. So we want to make sure that there are removal of threats to safety to really reduce any of that fear and anxiety. And one of the first considerations is being able to, of course, do an environmental scan. Sometimes it's removing the survivor from the actual incident to a safe place. But really, we want to be able to reconnect individuals like children with caregivers or individuals with their families. But here, in terms of providing physical safety, and we want to be able to provide clear and accurate information. We also never, and as victim advocates, you may be familiar with this, we never want to promise that somebody is physically safe, especially in terms of, unknown events, right? And again, right, providing them a space that can be removed from the disaster or crisis area. So in disaster sort of like situations, we use family reunification centers or family information centers really as the hub, oftentimes, of psychological first aid provision. So of course, right, we want to make sure that you're removing any broken glass or spills. If you have children that are part of the disaster area or part of your crisis scene that you're responding to, you need to make sure that those children are supervised and they have safe play options. So in terms of your preparedness efforts, right, do you have access to, for instance, a playpen, some children's toys, etc. Right? Ensure that people that are maybe experiencing psychotic symptoms, suicidal or homicidal thoughts or behavior are triaged and offered appropriate support, and they're not a danger to themselves or others. And then, of course, right, you want to pay attention to some of that ambient environmental safety. So being very mindful of noise. Noise can be incredibly triggering for disaster and crisis survivors. Be mindful of temperature, right? So sometimes when I'm providing crisis response, especially because of the effects on the limbic system, people are freezing when they start to de-escalate. So I'm keeping with me some, for instance, are there blankets, are there comfortable clothes, you have sweatshirts, etc. And then being mindful of lighting, of course, right? Are you not leading somebody into a dark space where they feel uncomfortable? And then you want to make sure that you address functional needs. So does somebody have medications that they may need? Do they have their adaptive equipment or assistive devices? So for instance, doing a quick check that somebody has glasses, or if they have wheelchairs, their wheelchair is functioning, or if they're using a walker, that they have everything that they need to do what it is that they need to provide for their own physical safety. So when we think about using an example of safety, so here I have a story or a vignette about Jennifer. And so we'll say that Jennifer is the survivor of an apartment fire. For victim advocates, maybe we'll say that this apartment fire was an arson, right? But she's been evacuated from her apartment, and you're the disaster crisis counselor who's responding. And that when you're meeting with her, she's really, really preoccupied with her refrigerated medication that she retrieved from her apartment running out the door, but she has no way to refrigerate it, right? She's talking rapidly, so she's obviously in some sort of distress about not knowing where she's going to be staying, what belongings that she lost or could be damaged, and what she's going to do there. But I want you to think, as a crisis counselor or a victim advocate or disaster crisis counselor, what are you going to do for Jennifer first before you do anything else, right? Would it be secure a place to store perishable medication? Would it be secure housing? So maybe provide an emergency voucher? Or would it be to discuss resources to aid in personal effects, right? So think about that. The answer here is, of course, that you want to secure the medication, right? Because it's perishable, and we need to ensure that, for instance, if she's diabetic and she needs that insulin refrigerated, we don't want to contribute to another crisis. We don't want to worsen the disaster, right? So once we store the medication and make sure that's secured, we want to then move from there, of course, right, to housing And then, of course, right, discuss some resources for her to be able to restore her personal effects. Some crisis workers may gloss over the medication and think, well, I'm not medical, so I don't really have anything to do with that. But it's really important, again, when we're considering physical safety, that we're addressing medical and functional needs. Okay. The next principle is going to be calm. So we know that disasters, right, they're going to cause a range of reactions. So we reviewed quite a few of those already. And that those reactions can really impair what we consider vital functioning. So sleep, decision-making, and coping. We also touched on how previous disasters or trauma can really interfere with how somebody is able to cope with a current disaster, right? But the other consideration is that people are incredibly resilient, and by the time you come in contact with them, they have a lifetime of coping. So it may have not been, they may have never lived through the event that you're responding to, but there are absolutely techniques and strategies that they've been able to use in the past to be able to help them manage anxiety and really improve their own personal coping. And psychological first aid really encourages you to build the resilience that an individual may have internally, right? So it really discourages, for instance, right, advice giving, etc. Okay, so for instance, right, if we can think about a specific example, and I really love working with crisis in children because I think that they're so resilient and so adaptive, and they can also be a lot of fun to work with, right? So for example, here I've got a little vignette about Sophia, and Sophia is in first grade. And then she was in a school bus accident caused by a drunk driver. But then after the incident, of course, right, we're to the point now where Sophia needs to go home and her mom is there to take her home. But she's visibly upset and she's refusing to get into the car, right? So of course, right, this is a triggering event for her, and she's having a resurgence of or an experience of symptoms, right? So the crisis worker can really help Sophia by using some very basic grounding techniques to be able to help her in that moment, right? But at the same time, talking about big emotions, asking her, you know, what helps her feel better, right? If maybe a stuffed animal, or maybe it is talking with her mom. But say Sophia doesn't really know, and for first graders oftentimes need a little bit of help getting there. You want to have in your arsenal a few different techniques to really help children calm down. And one of them is, of course, what I call square breathing. So I literally draw in the air, you know, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, and we draw that together, right? And I have the little or the young child do it with me. Another is sometimes they're not in a place where they can even engage in square breathing. And I have to do this with adults too. I'm just breathing while counting to 30, right? So simple breathing exercises to get somebody from the very primal fight, fight, or freeze into their midbrain. Another consideration is spaghetti breathing. And so it's like, you know, if you were to take a deep breath, so it's progressive muscle relaxation for kids, take a deep breath and tense up. And then as you exhale, being able to release everything out, to include, you know, going all the way down to your fingers and moving them like spaghetti. So having a couple of these kid-friendly interventions within your arsenal to be able to help people calm down is so important. But the other consideration, if you are providing a crisis or disaster response to a child, and that child is then returning to their caregiver or their parent, it's not good enough to just practice it with the child. You need to ensure that, number one, that mother or that father is emotionally stable, or that guardian is emotionally stable and okay to take care of their child. But beyond that, really, what I would encourage you to do is that really coach the parent in responding to Sophia or the child the next time a big emotion or a big behavior comes up, right? So that way the parent doesn't feel completely overwhelmed. They have an idea of what next steps they should be taking. Okay. The next consideration is, of course, connectedness. So people who are experiencing disasters really benefit from being connected with loved ones and individuals who are within their own communities whenever possible. But many times you may be responding to a disaster or a crisis event, and someone may not have the connections essentially that would benefit them at that point in time. And you sometimes have to be a little bit creative in fostering or creating these connections where they may not exist. So when I consider connectedness and pulling people together, we can think of a large scale disaster as an example. There may be two people that have experienced a similar situation. Or there may be someone that could be connected somewhere far away, right? That could be a support, and they can talk to that person over the phone or via an iPad, etc. But one of the other considerations is that, you can create connections with ongoing support and offering follow-up but on your own behalf, right? So, for instance, if someone is going off to a shelter, being able to take the next step and saying, hey, I know that right now you're feeling very alone. Would it be okay if I checked in with you tomorrow? And then making a note to check in with that person tomorrow and see how they're doing, right? So here we have an example of connectedness, and Jasmine is the vignette, and she was traveling for work, and there was an explosion, and it destroyed the building of the conference that she's attending in. In the evacuation, she's lost her phone, her wallet, and she's now in the information center, and she has nothing, and she's completely overwhelmed, as we would say, completely freaking out, right? She doesn't know anyone. She wants to talk with her family. She wants to get home to the state of origin, right? And you, as the disaster crisis counselor, are called to support Jasmine and many other people like her, right? If she's traveling in for an event, there's going to be several people that are probably doing the same. So you connect with her, and you get on the scene, you provide support, you do a little PI work, you get Jasmine in contact with her mother, and you offer a phone call. But the truth is that Jasmine's probably not leaving tonight, maybe not even tomorrow. She's probably going to go to some sort of emergency shelter, right? Until she can get a flight out. Depending on resources, her own personal resources, that may actually take longer, right? So in this case, there may be people that had also experienced a similar event, like within the same shelter or information center, right? And it's perfectly acceptable to connect these people. Hey, Jasmine, I noticed, Marie over here has gone through a similar situation. I'd love to introduce you, and then they can talk together and be able to share their experience and how they may be going through similar things. Super helpful to be able to provide connectedness between survivors with similar experiences. The next consideration is self and community efficacy. So we want to, again, tap into that survivor and community resilience and strength, and also their own self-determination as well, right? So we want to promote resources, but while we're giving information and engaging them in our own disaster intervention, we want to make sure that we're giving them options and choice. They feel their world is so out of control So if you can consider bringing a little bit of control back into the situation, it's going to impact like magnitudes and volumes in terms of how they can recover, right? So you want to really encourage them to be able to take as much ownership over their own personal choice and as possible. And this may look like a few different ways. It does not mean that we hand off a bunch of pamphlets and vague resources to a person and say, I want to encourage you self-determination and just have you call all these places on your own. That's incredibly helpful. It's also a big pet peeve of mine when people have experienced a disaster or crisis that we put the onus of helping on them. It does not create any dependence by offering a warm handoff or offering a caring connection. People are very, very overwhelmed with making simple decisions, having simple choices, remembering that their frontal lobe, the judgment part of their brain, is completely impaired. Following a disaster or following a crisis, and it's going to take time for them to regulate again. So it's perfectly acceptable and even encouraged to go the extra mile and help connect people directly with resources. But they should have choice and option whether they want to accept this help, and they should have choice and options in what resources they choose to accept, right? It shouldn't be the same resources for everyone. We want to provide as much as possible an individualized response for what they're going through, right? So for instance, I may provide a lot of education, and others, I'm going to provide follow-up. I'm going to provide direct referrals to behavioral health providers, et cetera, right? So I'm providing two different responses using the same model. So if we consider an example, right? So John was involved in like a multi-vehicle pileup. And when you respond to them, you find that John is not really talking about the pileup, right? He's talking about everything else. He's struggling with so many things to do. He's feeling incredibly overwhelmed. He no longer has a car. He's worrying about losing his job because he's now sustained an injury and he may not be able to go back to work right away. He's freaking out about providing for his family. And you as the advocate may not do this at the first interaction, but maybe you're doing a follow-up, right? You're validating John's emotions and you're offering him assistance and you're trying to point him in the direction of various resources, but every resource, he seems to get more and more overwhelmed, right? I think many of us have worked with clients like this. You point them in one direction thinking it will help, and then it almost causes them to de-escalate and to decompensate and really regress further into the trauma state. So oftentimes when it comes to situations like this, I really encourage you to help provide resources, but slow down one at a time and then explain them slowly, and then asking, well, what help do you need? Let's focus on one thing at a time. Let's see if we can address this, right? But also consider the level of support when you're providing these resources, right? So being able to make a caring connection or make an information referral, right? So if John is really stressed out about, for instance, essentially no longer having a car, checking in with John and saying, hey, John, are there any friends or family members that may be able to aid in transportation over the next couple of days while you work on your insurance claim and get that situated, right? And offering to call those people with John if he's incredibly overwhelmed could be an example. When we consider hope, of course, like the last one here, is that people who are experiencing disasters, really, when they can maintain optimism and expectancy, really, and a sense of predictability, have better outcomes. We want to really be able to focus people on things that they can control. So for instance, in the previous vignette or example, John is spiraling, right? He's completely freaking out and losing all bearing. And what we're doing is we're focusing John on certain tasks and certain items that can be helped in that moment. And we're really setting expectations about what's reasonable within the next couple of hours and next couple of days, especially if things are looking especially bleak. Giving people an awareness of what comes next, even if it's not great information, can really help restore some of their predictability. So we're going to go back to John a little bit. And John has experienced this car pileup. You've worked with John maybe a couple of times as the victim advocate, and you've connected him with resources, but he seems really, of course, understandably discouraged and worried. He's gone through a pretty large trauma. And one thing is that part of restoring hope is sometimes sharing different examples and sharing previous experiences, whether they be your own or previous clients, to be able to make John feel like what he's going through is a normal reaction to an abnormal event, and it's completely understandable. So what the crisis counselor does here in this example is she shares a case where somebody was able to connect with resources, and they were really overwhelmed by the amount of support their community provided. They talk about previous efforts in helping, right? Where they called his employer to ensure that, John was okay, and that, work was going to work with him to be able to allow him to come back to work at his own pace, right? And you're reminding John of his own resilience, community resilience, and essentially that there is hope and predictability in what seems to be a very unfair and unpredictable world. So those are the 5 foundational elements, right? The guiding principles, I guess, of you can see in psychological first aid. But then, right, there are some basic principles of psychological first aid that are oftentimes, engaged in with every time, right? So number 1, you're establishing a connection. In crisis scenarios, we need to be able to establish a rapport very quickly, right? So we're using humor. Oftentimes, if it's indicated, if it's safe, we're really connecting with people. We're being very kind. We're offering them very basic resources. So ensuring that you have a steady supply of water bottles, granola bars, stuffed animals, like little stress, like tchotchkes, things like that. Blankets. People get very cold, as I mentioned, in times of trauma, as you may know. So really, and providing these resources to them can help you establish a rapport with them very quickly. Then, as I mentioned, you want to assess for safety, enhance it whenever possible, but also provide emotional safety and comfort as well. So by doing that, we need to make sure that we're de-escalating and we're calming people who may be agitated or distraught. And then in terms of that, we're also at the same time triaging identified needs and concerns and what needs to be addressed right now. So for instance, if someone can't see or they don't have their medications, we need to be able to really kind of assess immediate needs and address those. We want to be able to provide practical assistance and information. As victim advocates, you know that you are not the end-all be-all for everyone that you interact with. You will not be their ongoing support. And as a crisis counselor, I'm quite familiar with that. I may interact with a person 1 to 3 times, but the truth is, I am not going to necessarily be there for them for the next months or years, right? So much of what I do is provide practical assistance, information, education, normalize their symptoms and presentation, and offer a sense of predictability around the event, what's happened, and how they can move forward with that. Next, of course, we're making connections. Again, as we mentioned before, we're connecting people to their friends, families, neighbors, supports, and in absent of those, we're offering follow-up with ourselves, and we're connecting to informal resources, whether it's somebody that they just met or whether it's an ongoing support group, etc. And Again, we want to promote adaptive coping techniques to include coping techniques that they may have already be familiar with, right? And if they don't have those, we want to have a few very basic coping techniques, such as breathing techniques, such as suggesting walks, having coloring books on hand in your disaster or trauma response kit, to be able to help people cope. So really encouraging that personal resilience. And then, of course, right, you're linking people to services and resources and collaborative supports. On your own, should you choose to think more or learn more about psychological first aid, there are core actions. And the wonderful thing about psychological first aid, and we'll talk a little bit about this, is that it's completely modular, right? So you can take pieces of psychological first aid and what may be applicable for someone else may not be, or what may be applicable for one may be completely different than for others, right? So you take elements of each one of these and really combine them for truly a customized response. So these psychological first aid core actions build on those 5 basic elements and these 8 basic principles to really combine all of this into a personalized and individualized really disaster response. And they are contact and engagement, of course, safety and comfort, stabilization and de-escalation, of course, right? Information gathering and prioritizing assistance, practical assistance, providing very basic things for people, connection with social supports, providing information on coping, right? Do a lot of education distribution in terms of disaster and crisis response. And then, of course, right, direct linkage with collaborative services. So why do we use psychological first aid as a foundational training for all responders, right? Why is it that you've heard about this so much, or this may be your first time, you will probably hear about it more. It's because it's so flexible, and it's adaptable for all ages, situations, and populations. It's been used here in the United States as well as globally and has been endorsed by the World Health Organization. It's modular and non-sequential, right? You can take elements of psychological first aid and combine them to various different episodes of crisis or different stages of disaster, right? And it doesn't mean that you have to do things in a certain order, right? Because it is this kind of unique, customizable intervention, it allows you to do a lot of different creative things with it. So really based on the client's current needs, you're determining what core action you're focusing on. And then once you address that, you might be shifting gears a little bit to address another core action. And you're picking and choosing in terms of disaster response to be able to stabilize the client in that moment. So when we think about disaster response, we have we can consider like the same event in the same model and really see a very different interaction, right? So here we have Jennifer, again, different Jennifer, but she's a nurse and she's really overwhelmed by the excessive work demands placed on her in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, right? She's had 3 years of workforce shortages, forced overtime, separation from her family, and now there is a surge of RSV, COVID, and flu. This may sound familiar because this is a real life example. It's not somebody that I worked with directly, but it's somebody that one of my colleagues at the health department who's trained in psychological first aid really was called. And Jennifer is not one person, she's many people, right? But of course, right? This is a model that can be applied even when we have really another traumatic event that's really stressing on someone who's experienced kind of a protracted disaster. But for Jennifer, when I'm reading this, and I haven't actually worked with Jennifer directly, or we'll be honest, or this type of client directly, I'm probably providing a lot of information on coping. Maybe I'm shifting gears to providing her information with social supports, but I'm probably assessing essentially what information. I may be doing some stabilization and validating and de-escalating her emotions. And also really kind of connecting her with additional resources to be able to manage her distress, right? So for me, like Jennifer's model is going to be very different than Peter, who is a client who's been diagnosed with long COVID, and he has, fatigue, chronic headaches, and it's caused him to have to adapt his working schedule. He's no longer full-time, and his lifestyle. So Peter now is very different than Peter 3 years ago. So because of the recent COVID surge, he's now contracted COVID again, despite being vaccinated with immunity, and he contacts the crisis line, freaking out and panicking, thinking he's going to be further debilitated, and now he's like infected his immunocompromised partner, right? So this again, right, psychological first aid, if we apply it, we're going to really be promoting safety and comfort and stabilization, and then maybe information on coping and different other core actions, but same model, very same event, different responses, right, when considering. Where to go to learn more? As I mentioned, psychological first aid, we only got a 1 hour orientation or overview. This is a 5 to 8 hour training, self-paced online. It takes about 5 to 6 hours, but it is completely free. So of course, right, you have the online training through National Childhood or the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. You can get on their website, create a login. It takes 5 minutes and go through the training. The other consideration is it also has skills for psychological recovery. So remembering that psychological first aid is providing that initial or response during essentially the initial kind of disaster, but then psychological or skills for psychological recovery is about treating and developing skills and resilience ongoing, right? So both of those are completely free, available through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Another key tool for you, and whether you complete the entire training or you just want to download the field operations guide, there's a lot of really helpful tips and tricks in there. But you have the complete field operations guide available to you. Another great thing about psychological first aid is there's actually a mobile app. So it's PFA, and you can download the mobile app to be able to essentially reference and utilize within your own work. So that essentially takes me to time, but I'm happy to be contacted. Here is my email. If anybody is curious about more about disaster response and crisis counseling, I'm happy to give you more information or point you in the direction of additional training and resources should you need it. So Rochelle, I know that's my time. I will turn it back over to you but also happy if there's time for any questions or considerations.
We have some time. Does anyone have any questions for Nicole, either online or in the room? We really appreciate you presenting today and giving us those additional resources. That is great. So thank you so much, Nicole.
Oh, absolutely. And I really do encourage people to be trained. If you want some volunteer opportunities, we also have the Utah Disaster Crisis Counselor Program that you can essentially volunteer or register to be a volunteer in case of a disaster with the state's Medical Reserve Corps. So for sure, check out those different things, and please reach out to me with anything. It was great to be here. I appreciate you all for the important, vital work that you do. So thanks, Rochelle.
Thank you, Nicole. Bye.
Bye now.